Art is one of our species' most fascinating behaviors. For no practical reason, we feel the need to create and admire this mysterious thing we call art. Defining art is difficult, and explaining why we admire it is even more enigmatic. We know that the origin of art reaches far back into prehistory, far beyond written language, agriculture, or cities. The oldest clear examples of artistic behavior appear around 100,000 years ago in South Africa, where early humans engraved geometric patterns onto ochre. As Homo sapiens spread out of Africa into Eurasia, they carried with them these same symbolic instincts. At roughly the same time in Europe and Southeast Asia, we see cave walls and rock surfaces erupt with vivid paintings of animals, abstract shapes, and handprints. It is clear that the spark of this cognitive fire dates back before we left Africa, and possibly even before our species. So when was that spark? We have found a number of objects dating back before our species that could be considered art. But before we go over them, we have to introduce the concept of a manuport. A manuport is an object that has been moved by humans from its original location without being modified. We see this at many Neanderthal and modern human sites. Fossils and crystals were often brought into caves from elsewhere, probably because they looked cool. I think we have all done it. You see a rock at the beach and you bring it along with you. Some of these objects look like faces or phalluses, and this may have attracted the symbolic minds of early humans. The first and perhaps most important manuport is the Makapenskot Pebble. It was discovered by a teacher in 1925 in a South African cave. It is a small reddish-brown pebble that appears to have a human face on it. With just a glance, the resemblance to a hominin face is striking. This is a classic case of pareidolia, where we perceive meaningful patterns in something random or ambiguous. But what makes this pebble even more fascinating is that it was found alongside Australopithecus africanus, a human ancestor which lived nearly 3 million years ago. They may not have been our direct ancestors, but our lineage did evolve from a species of Australopithecine. The Makapenskot Pebble was found in direct association with the remains of Africanus, and even more interestingly, based on the type of stone, it must have come from over 20 miles away, meaning an Australopithecine must have found this pebble and carried it with them. Australopithecines had quite different faces than we do, but the pebble still would have been reminiscent of their face. Perhaps it was a child who found the stone while playing in the dirt, or perhaps it was passed from group leader to group leader over successive generations. We will never know. At between 2.4 to 2.9 million years old, this is the earliest example of a symbolic object in the archaeological record. These Australopithecines were undoubtedly primitive in every sense of the word, yet this object may be evidence of their developing humanity. This pebble makes me think of the apes in the movie 2001: Space Odyssey. In the movie, the apes behave primitively, stuck in a stalemate with another group over a water source. It is only when they encounter the monolith that the apes learn to use tools and decisively defeat the other group. The mysterious monolith doesn't directly teach the apes anything, yet its presence triggers a cognitive awakening in the apes. The Makapenskot Pebble feels like a real-world monolith. Though it is smaller, more subtle, and we can never know the impact it had, it hints at a shift in the symbolic mind. It didn't need to be created or explained, it just had to be noticed. An Australopithecus carried this pebble over 20 miles, not for survival, but because it activated something in its mind. And in that moment, like the ape before the monolith, we may be witnessing the first flicker of the human mind awakening. Not all manuports necessarily had a symbolic function. Some may have simply been throwing stones. A collection of 176 manuports found in Olduvai, Tanzania may have been used by hominins over 1.8 million years ago. By measuring these stones, they found that they were deliberately selected and hoarded based on their weight. One group weighed 400 grams on average and another weighed only 220 grams on average. It is hypothesized that the larger ones may have been the ideal weight to be thrown by males and the smaller ones the ideal weight for females. It is also possible that the larger ones were thrown by Homo erectus and the smaller thrown by habilis or another species. The author of the paper researching this found that throwing stones may have evolved from manuports as stones of suitable size to be thrown. Rocks were likely the first projectile weapons used by our species. By 1.8 million years ago, these hominins could efficiently throw, and stone may have been used for hunting and defense. No other predator in the wilds of Africa could attack at range the way we could. If throwing stones was a common behavior used by early hominins, it makes sense that hordes of suitably sized stones were hoarded. It is amazing that this may be direct evidence of a long hypothesized behavior of throwing. Perhaps these hoards were located at the sleeping place of these hominins, so defense against predators would be easier and quicker. Either way, this example offers a fascinating glimpse into early hominid behavior. But I guess it doesn't quite cross the threshold into what we call art, more of a weapon, I guess. So now, let's turn to even more compelling evidence that brings us closer to the true origins of artistic expression. The Venus of Barakat Ram is a small pebble discovered at the Acheulean site on the Golan Heights. It dates to between 280 and 250,000 years ago, and has been proposed as one of the earliest examples of symbolic or representational art, possibly depicting a female figure. At first glance, the object seems natural, perhaps a coincidence of shape, but under magnification, archaeologists discovered grooves and incisions that appear man-made. These markings suggest modification with a sharp tool, likely a piece of flint. The grooves outline what some believe to be a head, arms, and a torso, a crude but unmistakable anthropomorphic figure. It's often referred to as a Venus figurine, like the famous examples from Ice Age Europe which clearly depict women. But unlike the later, highly stylized Venus of Willendorf, the Barakat Ram figurine is raw and ambiguous. Some scholars argue that it is not art at all, just a rock shaped slightly by erosion and imagination. The core debate revolves around whether the object was modified, whether it had a non-utilitarian function, and if it was meant to represent a human figure. Initial analysis and re-examination seem to confirm that it was indeed intentionally modified, though it is difficult to prove that it was modified to look like a human, and if it was a symbolic object rather than utilitarian. Others believe it represents the dawn of representational thought, not just recognizing meaning in an object, but deliberately altering it to reflect something abstract, in this case a human form. At over 250,000 years ago and being found in the Levant, it is unlikely that our species created the figure. Instead, it may have been created by early Neanderthals, or a form of late Heidelbergensis that we don't know much about. But the story doesn't end there. There is another possible Venus that was found at the edge of the Sahara. In 1999, near the town of Tantan in Morocco, a German archaeologist uncovered something extraordinary. It was small, only 6 centimeters long and covered in layers of sediment. At a first glance, it looked like a weathered chunk of quartzite, but upon closer inspection, its shape was eerily familiar. The object had a narrow neck, a broad lower body, and traces of what may be arms and legs. In its proportions, it strongly resembled the outline of a human figure. But here's where things get interesting. Microscopic analysis revealed a number of grooves and wear patterns that appear to have been created not by erosion, but by intentional percussion. Some researchers argue that it was shaped at least in part by human hands, and possibly by using stone tools. Like the Barakat Ram figurine, the Tantan object walks a thin line between natural formation and human intention. But if the incisions and modifications are genuine, and if they were deliberately made to enhance the figure's human-like shape, then we may be looking at one of the oldest known examples of symbolic expression. The layer it was found in dated to somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago, possibly placing it in the hands of Homo heidelbergensis or even late Homo erectus. What makes this figure particularly compelling is that some researchers believe it was not just modified, but also painted. Traces of pigment may have been applied to emphasize the form, suggesting not only symbolic thought, but aesthetic intent. It's difficult to say for sure. The figurine could be a case of pareidolia again, where we see something that wasn't meant to be seen. But if it was truly shaped and painted, then the Tantan Venus may be our earliest surviving attempt at depicting the human body, long before modern humans even existed. It raises an extraordinary possibility, that the desire to represent ourselves in art may be far older than we imagined. And whether or not the Tantan figure was fully intentional, its discovery tells us something profound. Even in the past, long before our species, the mind of another species may have looked at a rock and seen something more. Just imagining these hominids running around with these figurines is so fascinating to me. Were they dolls for young erectus girls, action figures used in mock hunts by Neanderthal boys, or maybe they represented revered ancestors? These are the kinds of questions that keep me interested in prehistory after all of these years. But enough about me, because we have some even more definitive evidence of erectus art. In the 1890s, A Dutch geologist named Eugene Dubois searched the rivers and caves of the island of Java in search of early human remains. On the banks of the Solo River, he found just that. Remains he described as a species in between humans and apes. They were remains that are now classified as Homo erectus. You have to imagine how eerie it must have been to come across these remains back when human evolution was still heavily debated. Staring at you from the soil are eye sockets which have been empty long before our species was born. While the discovery of Dubois led to decades of debate about the origins of humanity, the humble remains of shells at the site remained an afterthought. Then, in 2015, these shells were reanalyzed and what they found was shocking. Many of the shells show a punch right at the anterior adductor muscle, the muscle that keeps the shell shut. Experimental work showed that they were probably made with a shark tooth, and when penetrated, allowed Homo erectus to eat the muscles while preserving the shells intact. Why they wanted to keep the shells, we don't know for sure. One showed evidence for use as a scraping tool, and another really surprised researchers. It was found to be engraved with a geometric zigzag pattern. This was done with a sharp point, probably a shark tooth. It would have required a steady hand and a bit of force, and there is no doubt that it was deliberate. The evidence dates between 430,000 to 540,000 years ago. This makes the Trinil shell the oldest engraving we have ever found. What this engraving may have meant, we will never know. Maybe it was worn as a necklace. The carving was a decoration or a map of their home. Either way, it is a tangible connection to these very, very distant hominins. All the way in central Germany at a site called Bilsingzeblen, archaeologists uncovered an intriguing set of artifacts dating between 350,000 and 400,000 years ago. Here, the remains of Homo heidelbergensis were found alongside stone tools, animal bones, and something stranger. Among the bones, researchers discovered several elephant and deer bones engraved with long, straight, parallel lines. At a first glance, these grooves might seem like simple butchery marks, but a closer look revealed something else. The lines are evenly spaced, deliberate, and too regular to have come from cutting meat or scraping hides. Some bones even have cross-hatching patterns. Experiments show that they are likely carved with a stone tool, using controlled, intentional strokes. So what were they? Some researchers believe the engraved bones represent one of the earliest examples of symbolic behavior, perhaps decoration, counting, or even an early form of notation. Others argue that we cannot assume they held symbolic meaning just because they appear intentional. Archaeologists love saying ritual or symbolism whenever they see something like this, and I do as well. Regardless of their meaning, it is striking to see such human marks on such old bones. Just think of these guys out there hunting animals after a long hunt and just deciding they're going to carve some art or whatever they called it back in the day. Other manuports are also known from later sites, particularly Neanderthal sites. Red ochre, a red pigment found all over the world, is common at Neanderthal sites and early Homo sapien sites. This pigment is often present on objects and in burials. It is pretty universally accepted that red ochre served some symbolic purpose to these early cultures, though perhaps it was more of a practical use because a lot of cultures do use it for medicine, so it wouldn't be quite symbolic if they thought it had a direct medicinal purpose beyond, symbolism or, spirits. Fossils, as we mentioned earlier, are another common manuport found at Neanderthal sites. Belemnite fossils consisting of long cone shapes have been found at a number of sites alongside tools. It is unlikely Neanderthals knew that these belonged to ancient cephalopods, but they are aesthetically striking, and Neanderthals felt the need to hoard them. They also kind of look like a phallus. Maybe they were used for some reasons we won't discuss. We certainly have evidence from the Upper Paleolithic that objects like that were made. Rock crystal is another thing that is sometimes found at their sites. Though it can be turned into tools, they are often unworked, meaning these Neanderthals may have simply seen an aesthetic value to them. There are dozens of more nuanced remains that could be symbolic, could not be. It's really hard to tell with some of these things because they're just weirdly shaped bones or rocks or other objects. Either way, it is clear that even hundreds of thousands of years ago, the human mind was beginning to come up with the concept of art. At least in the Upper Paleolithic, and I'd say Neanderthals had an idea of art or symbolism, and I think this must extend back into Homo erectus times as well, as we've mentioned. It is just so fascinating for me to think about a species as far back as Australopithecus seeing a pebble that kind of looked like its face and carrying it around. Hopefully in the future we will find more remains like this that are enigmatic, but kind of proof that symbolism goes back way before our species, Neanderthals, or maybe even Homo erectus. If you enjoyed this little deep dive into ancient art and manuports, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Which was your favorite example? I'd have to say the Makapenskot Pebble, or however you say it. It's just so fascinating to me. Alright, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Arrivederci.